My assignment this morning is to give you a general overview of some of the programs, and then during the course of the day, you're going to have the opportunity to an individual workshop see in greater detail some of the programs we have in play here at Georgia State. I'm going to start with some national data. Some of you have seen this before, but if you haven't, it's rather sobering. This is the percent of Americans who hold the bachelor's degree disaggregated by economic quartile. The horizontal axis represents the last 40 years from 1970 to the present. And what you can see is that there have been significant demographic changes. They've almost entirely been in the top one half of the economic spectrum. For the top 25% of Americans, since 1970, that number has moved from about 40% to 82%. But those bottom lines are the ones that are going to concern us most today, and probably are the biggest issues on your campuses as well. For the lowest 25%, that blue line at the bottom, in 40 years, we've moved the needle a grand total of 2 points, from 6% to 8%. And one of the challenges of Complete College Georgia, and more broadly Complete College America, is a significant increase in the percent of Americans and Georgians that hold college credentials. Well, one reality becomes clear from this chart. The old ways are not going to work. The people, the students that had constituted the bulk of the college graduates, that group is already graduating, the upper 25% of Americans by annual household income. If we're going to make real progress, substantive progress, it's going to be by finding ways to succeed in that bottom realm with those lower bands. And that's a good introduction to Georgia State, probably to many of your campuses as well. Because the reality is the majority of students that we deal with at many of our campuses in Georgia from a day-to-day basis are the students that American higher education has failed over the last 40 years. These are Georgia State's Pell numbers over the last 7 or 8 years since the onset of the recession and then up to the present. And they also are sobering. They show the kind of economic challenge that many people in our communities are facing these days. We've moved over the course of 6 or 7 years from low 30% to almost 60% of our undergraduate population being on Pell. Well, the average Pell household earns $20,000 a year. The average Pell household is that bottom band on the previous chart that I was showing. And these are the students at Georgia State and many of your campuses, the students who constitute the majority of our students who are going to have to find innovative ways to succeed with. What we've done at Georgia State, as many of you know, is try to use data aggressively. We did it initially out of sheer need, that we didn't have the resources to be extravagant, to build the programs that we would like to have built. And so we needed to use data to find a way to really hone our attention upon where the problems were the deepest. One of the metrics that we use and we track for every single graduate and undergraduate student at Georgia State individually is unmet need. Unmet need is simply the difference between what the federal government says a full cost of an undergraduate education is at Georgia State. This year it's around $21,000. That includes room, board, tuition fees, books, all kinds of incidental living expenses. It's based upon a cost of living index from the federal government for your particular region or town. And what you do then is look for each individual student at the resources that you can pile together, pile up to support that student. In the case of Georgia State, about 3/4 of our students come in on the Hope Scholarship. As you just saw, the majority have Pell. Over 90% of our undergraduates have some kind of loan. There is a formula for a family contribution. And we assume the students are working and dedicating about 20 hours of work and the income from it to the full cost of their education. In an ideal world, the piling up of the resources for each student would equal the full cost of an undergraduate education. We do not live in an ideal world. This past fall at Georgia State, over 14,000 of our 25,000 undergraduates had some level of unmet need. And you can't say, well, why don't they get a job to fill that gap? Because we're already assuming in this formula that they're taking out loans, the family is making contributions, and they're working 20 hours a week. So if you think they're going to fill the gap by taking another job, you're asking them to be full-time students and to work full-time simultaneously. Unfortunately, this particular metric is not getting better, at least not for Georgia State students, and I bet if you track it at your campus, you'd find the same thing. The levels of average unmet need have increased substantially over the last few years, again, since the beginning of the recession and a little beyond. What we had is a growing level of unmet need, so the gap between what students have and what they need was getting larger. There was a slight dip at the beginning of the Obama administration because they actually increased eligibility requirements for the Pell program so that more families qualified. They also increased the total payout for Pell, the top payout. That helped our students. The number went down. Around 2011 is when the state of Georgia had some severe cuts to the HOPE program. All those gains that were made the previous 2 years were lost, and the numbers have continued up ever since. So here you can see the average. This past fall at Georgia State, the average undergraduate had about $7,000 of unmet need. For seniors who are often running out of their aid, the number was considerably higher than that. Unfortunately, too, there is a direct correlation between unmet need and academic performance. These are Georgia State numbers as well. Vertical axis are simply levels of unmet need from the students on the right who have all their need met to those on the, on the left, and to the far right where they have up to $15,000 a year of unmet need. The vertical axis just shows the percent of the Georgia State students in each of those bands who holds on to a 3.0 GPA. And what we find is that there is a very predictable correlation between unmet need and academic performance. As the unmet need goes up, academic performance goes down. Over 60% of the students who have all their need met are able to maintain a 3.0 GPA. That number goes down to about 27% for the students at the highest need levels here at Georgia State. That 3.0 GPA is all important in the state of Georgia, as you all know, because of the HOPE scholarship. This is older data intentionally from 2008, because we're going to talk about in a second some interventions that we've tried to mitigate this phenomena, which is disturbing. This is the difference between the graduation rates for students who come in on HOPE scholarship and maintain it while they're here at Georgia State, and the students who come in on the HOPE scholarship and lose it. A 40-point drop 5 years ago between those two groups at Georgia State and their graduation rates. Huge, huge impact. You might say, well, of course, this makes sense. You know, students who don't hold on to the 3.0 GPA, they're not as good students. Of course, they're not going to graduate at a as higher rate. But when we drilled down and looked at these students, the vast majority were not bombing out academically. It's not that they were failing. You can be a very solid student on path for graduation with a 2.8 or a 2.9 GPA. The problem was that these are mostly low-income students, and even though the HOPE scholarship is officially a merit-based scholarship, right, because it's based upon academic performance, for many of our students, it's really an access scholarship. The only way they have access to our institutions is because they have the scholarship in hand. You take away a $6,000 a year scholarship from a student from a family with $20,000 a year annual household income, you're pulling the rug out from under that student. They're not going to be able to go to a bank and get a loan for $6,000 or go to mom and dad and get a handout. That's just not going to happen, at least for the vast majority, and you see that reality in the numbers for our graduation rates at least 5 years ago. So again, what we've done is try to use our resources in a focused, strategic fashion by really using data to understand where the problems are, what are the problems impacting our students, to experiment and pilot programs. We've been very willing to admit that many of our programs have not worked first time out, and we've had to go back and revise them in significant ways before they began to become effective. We have promoted these programs to donors and vendors who would be willing to buy into not just the promise of helping students, but the actual data-based results that we could show via our pilots. We've never had such success going with foundations, Goizueta, Coca-Cola, and so forth, until we came equipped to those meetings with the data from our pilot program showing this is what we can do if you give us this funding. And then one thing that has distinguished Georgia State nationally is the size of our programs. The programs I'm going to describe and that you'll hear about this day are not in the dozens, but they impact hundreds, thousands, in some cases tens of thousands of students every year. I go to many of these conferences about student success, hear wonderful innovative programs, and you ask, well, how many students are in that program? Well, we've got 18, we've got 46. Well, that's not going to be transformative. We've never piloted programs here at Georgia State unless we have some reasonable model for scaling them up so they can be genuinely impactful upon the student body. I'm going to go through a couple programs quickly, and this is in some ways a teaser for some of the breakout sessions that you'll have during the day. Almost all of these programs will be discussed in much greater depth in one or the other of the workshops. One of our newer programs is the Summer Success Academy. What we were doing, like many universities do, in part it's, I think, a cynical game in order to boost quality numbers during the fall, is taking our weakest freshmen from the fall applicant pool and deferring their admission to the spring semester. That way they don't pull down SAT scores, they don't become part of the cohort that gets tracked for the graduation rates and so forth. The fact of the matter, though, is you're taking your weakest academic students and starting them at a time when they have the least amount of support. Every other freshman has had a 6-month head start. All of the orientations on our campuses have occurred. You're throwing them into the deep end and hoping that they swim. We looked at the data, and we weren't surprised, but we were sobered by how many of them were sinking, that they were doing very, very poorly. So we made an institutional decision, and this took going to President Becker and getting his buy-in, because it also meant that we took a hit in our SAT scores of about 19 points. But we said, we're going to take the lowest 5% of our incoming freshman class, who we had previously deferred to the spring semester, and send them a very different letter. Say, welcome to Georgia State, we're glad to have you in the fall, as long as you come for the summer semester. They come for the full 7 weeks. There's some financial benefits to this with Pell that you can learn about during the workshop, but it actually pays off for the students and actually is not expensive in the long run. They take 4-credit courses. These are not remedial classes. They are regular 4-credit courses, and they do 7 credit hours worth of work. And you can see some of the results up here on the board. This past summer, they finished those 7 credit hours at a 3.3 GPA. What a great head start on their academic year. Instead of being 6 months behind, they're several months ahead. And when you talk to these kids, that's exactly what they say. Everybody else was coming to campus and just trying to figure things out, and I felt like an old pro. What a nice grounding to give these students. Last academic year, the lowest 5% of the freshman class by our predictive analytics coming in actually finished with a slightly better GPA than the upper 95% because they had this strong grounding from the start. It can make a difference. Freshman learning communities are quite large. 70% of our incoming freshman class now goes through these freshman learning communities. They are low cost. They basically are burdened upon our registrar's office to organize registration in a particular fashion. So we take the students in groups of 25, we arrange them around meta majors, and we can talk more about that as the workshops go on, but basic themes. When you're dealing with lots of first-generation low-income students, as we are, you don't necessarily want to push students into a major if that's going to be a bad choice for them. Because the worst thing for graduation rates is the student who decides in their junior and senior year that their major is not a good fit and they're going to switch, or a student who is in a major that doesn't fit well and who gets poor grades as a result. So we put them in these meta majors, general themed freshman learning communities, arranged in groups of 25, and they travel and take all their fall classes together. In some cases, like English composition, they're the only 25 students. In other cases, they're blended in a lecture of political science with 50 other students. But they get to know each other, they develop study partners in a big campus like Georgia State with 32,000 total students. It's nice to be able to develop those friendships. If they've missed a class, they know they have somebody to turn to. Again, you can see the results here. They're not only higher GPA during the freshman year, better retention rate, and that 4-point jump in the retention rate carries over into the graduation rates as well. Again, building a good foundation for these students. In response to some of those hope numbers we were looking at a minute ago, we developed this program that we call Keep Hope Alive. Simple in concept. When we first looked at the problem of the loss of hope and the 40-point drop in graduation rates, one of the first responses is, why don't we try to institutionally fill the gap that is lost in hope dollars by the students every year whose GPA drops below a 3.0 GPA. Georgia State, that's over $25 million a year. We didn't have anywhere near the resources. We were actually given $40,000 by our GSU Foundation to try to speak to the problem. So what do you do with $40,000? What we came up with was the following model. We give, for the semester after a student loses the Hope Scholarship, we're now giving them $500, actually for 2 semesters, as long as they sign a contract. And any student who gets money from any of our programs, scholarship or otherwise, has to come into an office and sign a physical contract so they can actually talk to somebody and recognize there's something that they're giving back in return for the money they're getting. And what they do is sign a contract agreeing to go through financial literacy training, because one of the worst things some of these students do is make bad decisions, like putting all their charges on a credit card with no plan for paying it off. Then you find they go into collections. They go through academic skills workshop. They agree to meet one-on-one with their advisors multiple times. And even though it's very difficult for a student, I think this is across the system, but these are GSU numbers, who loses hope to gain it back again, only about 9% of the students who lose hope gain it back again. The first time we tried this program, 40% of them gained it back. The next year, 50%. Recent years, 60% of the students gaining the scholarship back again. In that time period from 2008 where I showed you the data, at that point, 51% of Georgia State students were losing the Hope Scholarship. Only 49% were maintaining it. Now we've got that number up to 75% through some of these interventions. Another relatively low-cost program, especially if you have lots of low-income students, is supplemental instruction. One of our competitive advantages is we've got thousands of work-study students and students in other aid programs that have to work for the university. And previously, they'd worked in offices, some work in the cafeteria or the library and so forth. What we did is we looked at the data across our curriculum of the courses with the highest DFW rates, which courses were tripping the most number of our freshmen and sophomores up. And then we correlated that with the grade rolls from our students who are on work study and other sort of support programs, and we found students who had done well in those same courses. Now we pull the students out of their assignments, so we pull them out of the office assignment or the library. We pay them to go through training. We pay them to sit in on the same class, the same undergraduate class they were successful in, so they get to know the new professor and the new students. And we have them and pay them to do instructional sessions during the week, so that it's a fellow undergraduate who has succeeded in the course, helping other undergraduates to succeed in the same course. We've expanded this program from the initial group that you see up on the screen here to about 25 different courses in the freshman and sophomore curriculum. And it's had a big impact upon students. We track all of the attendance of our students in our programs by card swipes. So they take their university IDs, swipe a pad that's connected to a laptop or a desktop, and we keep all the demographic information. We found for students who during a semester attend at least 3 of those instructional sections, their GPA is about half a letter grade higher. They're being retained at a much greater rate. And we've been able to scale this program because it's relatively low cost, very large. So last year, there were almost 10,000 students who benefited from supplemental instruction in being tutees. We've also found that the tutors are benefiting as well. They're graduating at higher rates now because they're spending their time learning their discipline in greater depth. One of our big transformations was with a course that I'm sure is a challenge at many of your campuses, with the basic math requirement. We all know that for a student to get an associate's or a bachelor's in the state of Georgia, they need to pass a college-level math course. At Georgia State, our struggles were protracted and challenging ones because there was such high failure rate. 5 years ago, about 40+% up there, 43% of the students in college algebra, pre-calc, and introduction to statistics were getting a D, an F, or a W. And the damaging thing about this course in particular, often it was taken from the first semester as a freshman year course, and the students needed to pass the requirement. So if they got an F in the fall, they often signed up for it again in the spring. No better real prospects for doing better the second time out. Some students were dropping out, losing Hope scholarships by this one requirement alone, because they'd circle back 3 or 4 times. Even if they eventually passed the course, they'd used up so many credit hours that they were running out of Hope at the other end, because the 127 hours that Hope covers were running out before they reached their bachelor's. So we made a radical change, again, piloting it on the small scale. We use an Emporium model now. You'll get to visit the what we call the Mile Lab and see a little bit of this in action today. But the model is to 1 hour of traditional math lecture, 3 hours a week they spend in the lab. But they spend it in the lab with classmates and with an instructor so that it is still a communal experience. We didn't have any luck with the students going back to their dorm rooms or back home and doing these programs on their own. So it still is a communal experience. Each student, though, is working on adaptive learning exercises. We all know how important in math it is not to fall behind. If you don't understand the first week, by the third week, you're totally lost. So here are adaptive learning exercises that if you're struggling, will give you more questions and challenge you more. If you've already mastered a topic, we'll move you on so you're not bored. We've had very good results. The DFW rates went down markedly, and again, the scaling. Last year at Georgia State, we didn't offer a single seat of traditional lecture of college algebra, introductory statistics, or pre-calculus. Every single seat we offered, 7,500 seats, were offered in this format because we found that this is what works so much better for students. The difference between 7,500 students taking a course at a DFW rate of 43% and 21% is over 1,600 more students passing that course the first time through. And we haven't changed the measures at the tail end. So the final exams and so forth, the standards we're holding to the students are still the same. More students are mastering the material. We've made many changes to our academic programs. This is one example, and again, there'll be a breakout section where you can hear more about some of how we revise programs. We found there are particular problems with a number of departments who were adding special requirements for getting into majors. This is an example of some of our nursing data. The bands here are GPAs at GSU. So these are students who have lower GPAs all the way up to a 4.0 at GSU. The red band is the graduation rate at Georgia State for students in each of those grade bands. And what you find, not surprisingly, as the GPA goes up, the graduation rate goes up. What the gray bands represent are the graduation rates for the nursing program. And you can see some good news there. The really good students at the high end of the band were graduating at or above the average rate for Georgia State, but you also see a lot of white space there. And that's disturbing because it means that all these students from basically a 3.5 GPA and below are underperforming, and underperforming significantly. I mean, look at that group from 2.8 to 3.0. Their graduation rate's about half what the average Georgia State student in that band is. So we brought that to the department and had some detailed discussions about what's going on here. I think most of you know what's going on here. We have a large pre-nursing program. 80% of the pre-nursing students are rejected and don't get into the BSN. The 20% that get into the bachelor's program doing just fine. The other 80% who spent 2 years taking courses, many of which then no longer apply to what becomes their major because they're not nursing majors, then find themselves running out of funded support before they can reach the credit hours they need for their new major, or find themselves leaving the university and so forth. Big problems. One thing we did, and with the help of the USG, is track the students who were leaving Georgia State after they left for what happened to them. The blue line represents here the number of students each year who are not admitted into our nursing program but are in pre-nursing, and unfortunately you can see that number going up. The red are the students from that cohort, the blue cohort, who left the university. The green and the purple, which you can barely see, and that's the point here, are when we track these students out across multiple institutions, how many of them ever ended up with a bachelor's or an associate's degree? Unfortunately, you can barely see it. So they're leaving Georgia State with junior standing, and some of them are getting associate's degrees, some of them are getting bachelor's, most are getting nothing at all. So we knew we had to do something different, and we made radical changes. We've added alternate pathways for the students who don't get into the BSN. In the last 18 months, we've added undergraduate degrees in public health, health management, and health informatics, alternate pathways for these students. We've also worked to try to advise these students better so they can know what to expect, to expose them to alternate careers. But I think the most significant change, which wouldn't have come without the use of data and analytics, is we've got the nursing faculty to change the rules. This fall, for the first time in Georgia State history, the nursing program has agreed to admit nursing students into the BSN at the end of the freshman year instead of at the end of the sophomore year, cutting a full year of courses that will not apply to the major of 80% of the students taking them from the curriculum. And that was done largely through analytics. And we assured them, and I am going to back this assurance up, that they could do a better job predicting which students would succeed in the BSN using data after 1 year than they were currently doing not using data but having 2 years worth of coursework to look at. So we've done those sorts of changes throughout the curriculum. There will be a session on some of our use of technology to help with customer service and dealing with demand for help in financial aid, registration issues, and so forth. We are one of the first universities in the country to sign on to a product that was up to this point used almost exclusively in the business world, a knowledge-based system called Parature. This is one of those systems like you see when you go onto the Apple website and you ask a question that can learn over time, learns answers to questions, and so the roster of issues that it can address becomes greater and greater. We had huge problems at the front end of every semester with immense numbers of phone calls and emails. It was hard to staff up because it would only be for those 2 weeks, and then the demand would go way down. We went live with this new Parature system full scale this January, and what we found in the month of January, the usage was very high. We had over 7,000 students use it. We saw a big drop in the number of students who actually wrote emails into our one-stop shop for help. We saw a significant drop, although it's still very high, in the number of phone calls we received the first week of the semester, and a significant drop in wait times as well. It's those sorts of things to try to end the frustration that students have when they can't get the help they need, especially if they're teetering on whether to persist or not. You don't want to put those roadblocks up. And again, some of these analytics can really help. We got some attention for our Panther Retention Grant program. This is a completely common sense program that isn't used, in my estimation, enough nationally. As Chief Enrollment Officer, one of the most troubling times of the semester is during the fee drop. You all know we're required at the end of the first week to wipe out any student from their course record who hasn't paid 100% of tuition and fees. Well, these are exactly the students you don't want to be wiping out. For one thing, they're academically qualified. They've met prerequisites. They're registered for their courses. Two, they want to be there, and that's not easy, as you all know, to get the students who want to be in their classes, and we're taking their schedule and wiping it out, in some cases because they owe $300, $500, $600. President Becker and his wife gave us $40,000 a couple years ago to say, do something different with it. And what we started to do is, at the time of the fee drop, we drop the students and then immediately turn around and start calling students who meet at least two metrics, that they have genuine unmet need, and secondly, they're on path to graduation via some academic analytics I'll talk about next. And if they meet those two criteria, then we call them up and say, we're going to cover your bill. Come on back to class Monday morning, don't make other plans. Initially, the program was very small, about 40 students that first semester. The average one of these grants, as they played themselves out, is about $900. Initially, we had students hanging up on us. They thought it was a scam. They didn't believe anybody from Georgia State would be offering them free money. But part of the benefit of this program is to deflect those kind of attitudes and convince the students that we're really on their side. We've been able to scale it up amazingly in a short period of time. Yeah, last year we used over $2.5 million, brought back 2,600 students into their classes via this program alone. 2,600 students. Over half of them were seniors, and for the senior, often the seniors are the ones who need the money because they're the ones running out of other sorts of aid. They've used up their HOPE hours, they've used up Pell hours, and so forth. So, and of the seniors we gave the grants to last year, 70% of them graduated within 2 semesters after getting one of these grants. So it's making a huge difference, hundreds of additional college completions. Now you might ask, well, where in the world do you come up with $2.5 million after a couple years? Well, for one thing, this program is popular with stakeholders because it's helping exactly the sort of students that donors and other people want to help. Hardworking, need a little boost, just need a little more money to get them through. But the finances of this program makes it so sensible for us to adopt more broadly. Because, and I made this argument to our CFO, what happens to if the average grant is $900, the $900? Well, it's to cover only tuition and fees, so we give the student $900 electronically. Immediately, we take 100% of it back because it's all just covering the rest of their tuition and fee bills. So we get that 100% back. But we not only get the $900 grant back, but all of these students have paid down some of the bill on their own, in many cases 3/4, 80%, 90%. So we immediately not only get the $900 back, we get another $3,000 back from what they've used with Pell and loans and family contribution and so forth. And then these students persist. so they stay enrolled for a couple more semesters after that. So what might be an investment of $900 or $1,000 pays for itself on average 6, 7 times over, because the university is getting back just from net revenues $6,000 or $7,000 from that $1,000 we invested. That's how we've scaled it up so large so quickly, is in part because it's actually added additional revenues for the university rather than pulled us away. Last program I'll talk about, but our biggest initiative, and you'll have the chance to go to our advising center and hear a lot more about it. We partnered with the Education Advisory Board to develop an advising tracking system, web-based platform. We use 10 years of our own RPG data, over 2.5 million grades. We have nightly feeds from Banner. We use predictive analytics for each student, so we now can predict how every student will do at every major at Georgia State, as well as many of our courses. And we're tracking the students for what we call alerts, over 700 of these alerts every night as we update our Banner data. Now, what is an alert? The easiest way to explain it might be the following. These are some examples. This is actual Georgia State data. One thing we found by looking at 10 years of data is that the grade that a student gets in the first course they take in what eventually becomes their major is very predictive of how they will do as far as graduation is concerned. This is actual data from political science, and it says if a student becomes a political science major and you look at the first course they took in political science and they got an A or B, they graduated at a very good rate. For Georgia State, that's a really strong graduation rate. Unfortunately, if they get a C in the course or below, the graduation chances, their prospects drop way, way down. Not surprising to any of us who have been in the classroom. The C student in Introduction to Political Science obviously has some issues with reading or writing, or something's going on there to explain why the student got a C in the introductory course. But the reality is, what did Georgia State do in the face of the C student who got a C in political science and then majored in political science for decades? Absolutely nothing. And probably at many of your campuses, absolutely nothing. So now an alert goes off. The advising office and the person responsible for the student gets notified that this has happened, and the goal is to get in there and get help to the student, not so they can immediately switch majors, but so they can succeed in the major that they have selected. A great example of this is accounting, where we found via the historical data that even though the accounting faculty say that a student needs a minimum grade of a C in their first math course in order to take an upper-level course in accounting, that if all they got was a C or even a B minus, they were doomed to do really poorly in those upper-level accounting courses. Actually, the data showed they needed at least a B plus in that first math course in order to do well in upper-level accounting courses. So we didn't go to the faculty and have them change their prerequisites. What we do now have is an alert that goes off if a student is an accounting major and gets below a B plus in their first math class, and we try to get them help. They need tutoring, they need an additional math course before they begin to take upper level courses, get D's and F's, and then begin to spiral out of control. I think this program is going to help us succeed with more students with some of our most difficult majors. This is actual data from a bio student, pre-med student in biology. And what is clear, when he first enrolled in 2008, before we had the system live, he made all kinds of bad decisions. The first semester he was supposed to take a chem course. He didn't register for that. He was also supposed to get a minimum grade in the math course. He didn't get that minimum grade. But again, we did absolutely nothing. And as you scroll down this student's history, you see him digging himself deeper and deeper into a hole, to the point where now he would have to, and we have tried to move him to a different major. But what if we had got those interventions from that first semester when he first needed it? Wouldn't that make a big, big difference? One of the great features of this system that we worked on with EAB is what we call the major matcher. What the system is able to do, since for every student we have predictive analytics for how the student will do in every undergraduate major at Georgia State, is the student and the advisor can pick any major. Immediately it will pop up on the screen a chart that looks like this. The grade shaded area are the courses the student has already taken that apply to that major with the grades that the student has received. The white represents the student's courses that would still be required, as well as predictive analytics for how the student will do in those courses. The color coding, red, green, and yellow, represent whether this is a major that the student is well prepared for, well equipped for, or not. And what you can see is a significant sea change in the way these conversations have unfolded. In the past, it would be you were pre-med, you're bombing, pick something else. Now it's an actual structured and, yes, data-based discussion between the advisor and the student, where you can actually make a concrete and reasonable judgment between various options. It's not reasonable to switch to nutrition for this student because a lot of the same courses he's been struggling in apply to that major as well. Now you might say, well, that's a no-brainer, but when we looked at our data, I can't tell you the number of students who, say, were rejected from the nursing program as pre-nursing students, they didn't get into the BSN, and decide, I'm going to be pre-med, or I'm going to be a chem major now, oftentimes taking the very courses that they're struggling with and planting them in their new major. So this is a much more constructive discussion. We went live with the whole system and the new advising space that you will visit in 25 Park Place. We have 2 floors in an office tower right in the center of downtown for our advisors now. On February 15th, of last year was when the Advising Physical Center opened. We went live with the tracking system about 6 months before that. But in 1 year of having this new Central Advising Center open, we had 33,900 individual student visits meeting with advisors in this 1, 2 floors facility at Georgia State. That's about 3 times the number of students who would come in previous years. And we polled every student anonymously as they were leaving about what the experience is, what they liked, whether they found this problematic. And what we found is the students were more likely to come back for advisement because they found it to be much more concrete and informative. Before it seemed like, getting some homespun advice from a friend. Now it was something that they could actually learn from and gain information about themselves they didn't understand before. None of them saw this as intrusive or problematic and so forth in that way. They found it genuinely informative and helpful. Because we have analytics for how every student is doing, whether they're off track, on track, or this middle ground for graduation, we also can track this by any kind of combination, by college, by department. Here are some of the department numbers. The challenge that has emerged, because behind each of these colors is a meaningful relationship to predictive analytics and to how students are doing, is not so much that, what you see here is that there are a higher percentage of art majors at Georgia State who are on path for graduation than chem majors. It's not surprising to any of us. But as we look at this longitudinally from one semester and one academic year to the next, can chemistry move the percent of its students over from yellow and red to green and be more competitive and put more students on the right path? So we've got those kind of challenges going on now. Every advisor can track his or her own cohort with regard to these colors as well, and it's become a good kind of competition. You want to move more of your students from the red and the yellow to the green. Over the first year, we were live with the advising system. There were some good metrics coming out of the data we collected. One is that we saw a significant increase in the number of freshmen who changed their majors. In and of itself, that's not a good thing. Changing majors can slow students down. But if you're dealing with lots of first-generation low-income students, and you can get them to pick the right major early in their career, the major that will be the one they graduate with, that's a big victory. And what we found is that with the availability of this system and the advising interventions we had, more students were changing their major, and the majority of those students were making wise decisions, at least based on predictive analytics. We also try to look at the following question. In any given year, how many of our Georgia State undergraduates actually improved their chances of graduating over the course of the academic year? We'd like to naively think it's 100%. Well, every student should be getting closer to graduation. We know that's not the case. If a student is a biology major and ends up flunking one of the required courses, they haven't helped themselves that academic year. They've actually moved further away from their chances of graduating. So what we did is use the 2 baseline years before we went live with the system and asked that question: how many students actually improved their analytics, the predictions for their graduation over the course of the year? We didn't assume that number would be 0 either, because we already had all kinds of programs in place. And what we found for the 2 years before we went live with this new system, it was about 55, 57% of the students who were moving positively over the course of the academic year. What we found in the first year we were live with the system, as you can see, is a significant increase, over 70% of the students increasing their chances for graduation. So that's a big victory. We've gotten lots of nice national attention for this. I will say this, and it's part of the messaging: we need to do better. As we do better using these programs, there's such skepticism out there about higher education on the part of the business community and on the part of politicians. that one of the things that has been most interesting to me is going in front of groups and finding the level of surprise that they have that we're doing anything like what I've been describing so far this morning. I was at a presentation not knowing that the CEO of SunTrust Bank was in the room talking about all this sort of thing. And he actually pulled himself out of the meeting as I was exiting after my talk and came to talk to me about how he wanted to support our efforts because they fit so well with what his bank is concerned with. One of the points he made was that they have a mission at SunTrust to try to connect with low-income families. That's a difficult challenge because they're not the typical customers who come in to SunTrust Bank. And so one thing he liked about what we were doing is really finding and targeting low-income families at a pressure point where they would really need help and advice. But the other thing he said was he couldn't believe, he was really surprised that anybody in higher education would be looking at data and making predictions and judgments and so forth the way that we were. And this was something he wanted to get on board and support. So it's a great entry to kind of building rapport with important stakeholders. But the real reason we're doing this are these numbers, not the ones on the previous slide. These are our conferrals over the last 5 years. In 5 years, Georgia State has moved from 5,800 conferrals a year to over 7,500, almost 7,600 conferrals. That's about 1,700 increase over a 5-year period. In that same period, just to give you a comparison, our total enrollment has gone up about 2%. Our conferrals have gone up about 30%. We have had to make the transition recently from, we used to hold graduation in the basketball arena. Now we're holding it in the Georgia Dome, a nice problem to have. These are graduation rates over the last 10 years. They are not where we want them to be yet, nor where we have committed them to be, but that's significant progress from 32% to 53% over the last 10 years. For all the national universities, that's a category that U.S. News uses. This is the biggest increase over that time period. But let me put it in some context. One way to understand what that 53% graduation rate means is to compare it to other national universities. Each of these diamonds represents a national university, and what you see nationally is there is a direct correlation between the percent of the student body on Pell and graduation rates. As the Pell rates go up, the graduation rates go down very predictably and very precipitously as well, quite a dramatic decline. That's where Georgia State stands on this chart. Of all our peer universities now, we have both the highest Pell rate and the highest graduation rate, a nice situation to be in. But evidence that these programs really do make a significant difference. We're not talking about marginal change, we're talking about transformation. This is also important data. These are our graduation rates by race and ethnicity. The blue box represents where we were 10 years ago. The red represents where we are currently. So the first thing to notice is that all groups, racial and ethnically, have benefited from these various programs. But my observation is, and it's pretty clear from the way this chart is set up, that the more distressed a group was at the start of our efforts, the more they have rebounded and benefited from these sorts of interventions. So you can see the graduation rates increased more for our African American students than our white, and more for our Latino students than our African American. And even though the Hispanic students, Latin American, Latino students were the worst off as we began some of these initiatives. My suspicion is the reason is fairly simple, that the better K through 12 experience, the better resources a student had to start with, the less transformation these kind of interventions are going to have. But for some of the Latino students we serve, for some of the African Americans we serve, and for some of our white students as well, they've had almost no personalized intervention that has really reached out and helped them and tried to serve them in their previous experiences before coming to us. So for the first time, sitting down with somebody and saying, you could do it this way, or having that added help in math and not just falling behind from week one and so forth. These are sorts of things that for students who have the weakest backgrounds really can make the most difference, and I think in some ways our numbers show that. The green bars represent something I hope you're all doing. I know the USG is going to make much easier because we are committing to moving towards, or at least talking about moving towards, tracking students across multiple institutions. One thing you'll find if you look at the national data is that lower income low-income students are far more transient than their middle class and upper middle class counterparts. Their families gain jobs, lose jobs, move across the country, change state. Financial reasons have them start at a different institution. What the green represents are the same cohort of students at Georgia State, represented by the red bars, tracked out across multiple institutions using National Student Clearinghouse data. And what, again, you can see is huge differences. The difference at UGA, and maybe we have some from UGA here who can tell me, but between their red bar and their green bar is only a few points. But when you're dealing with large numbers of low-income students, you'll find that the bump is much, much greater. And so when you look at the success rates of the students we started with, we'd love them all to graduate from Georgia State, but I will say ultimately the goal of Complete College Georgia and Complete College America is not an institutional one, it's a community one. And the nice thing to see is that these students, even if they've moved out or moved on for various sorts of reasons, are succeeding at large rates at other institutions, rates 25 or more points higher than the success rates from just looking at our institutional numbers. So in summary, we've set records for conferring degrees here at Georgia State via the use of predictive analytics. We have been named now one of the top 100 Hispanic-serving universities in the nation. We now rank number 49 in the nation, number 1 in Georgia for the number of Asian Americans we're graduating. The Education Trust, which is a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., has credited us with having the second highest increase in graduation rates for underrepresented students in the nation over the last period of time. This is one of their charts looking at Hispanic or Latino rates between 2004 and 2010, and you can see we've been up over 37 points over that time period. And then for the last 2 years, and this is an important kind of historical shift because it's the first time in U.S. history that this has happened. Georgia State, for the last 2 years, has graduated with the bachelor's degree more African Americans than any other nonprofit university in the country. The middle chart here shows the percent of students and graduates that fit the category, in this case African American. It's about 31% of our graduates. The next 4 on the list are all HBCUs, admittedly considerably smaller enrollments, but it does speak, again, to the power of some of these programs and the impact that they can have, that a school with about 30% of the graduates from being African American can now have the largest number of conferrals in the country. So that's the story. I'm happy to quickly answer any questions, but then I'm going to give you some logistics about how you can go and learn more about any of these programs. Are there any quick questions here that you'd like to ask?